My name is Evan Mitchell, and for 10 years, I thought I had it all. Olivia, my wife, was the kind of woman people envied. A perfect smile, warm laugh, and a charm that could make anyone feel at ease. We lived in a beautiful house in the suburbs, complete with a white picket fence and two golden retrievers, Max and Charlie. I worked as a civil engineer, while Olivia was a schoolteacher. Our life felt like a dream I never wanted to wake from. The cracks began to show subtly. At first, Olivia started coming home later than usual. She said it was because of staff meetings and parent-teacher conferences, which made sense, until it didn't. I didn't think much of it. Life got busy, and I was working overtime to secure a promotion. But it wasn't just the late nights. It was her sudden interest in her appearance. Olivia always took care of herself, but now she was getting weekly facials, buying expensive lingerie she never wore around me, and smiling at texts that weren't from me. It gnawed at me, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Until one afternoon when her phone buzzed, and she left it on the counter while she went to shower. The name, Dr. Parker, flashed across the screen. It was strange. She hadn't mentioned needing to see a doctor, let alone frequently enough for them to text her after hours. Curiosity got the better of me. I swiped the notification and opened her messages. My heart froze. The texts weren't about medical appointments. They were intimate, affectionate. They spoke of stolen moments, secret plans, and promises to finally make things official. I felt like the floor had dropped out beneath me. My chest tightened, and I had to sit down before I passed out. How could she? Why would she? I wanted to burst into the bathroom, confront her, demand answers. But instead, I set the phone down exactly as it was and left the house. For hours, I wandered the city aimlessly. I replayed every moment of our relationship, searching for clues I might have missed. Was I blind? Had I been so consumed by work that I failed to notice her drifting away? The answers didn't come, only the growing pit of despair in my stomach. That night, Olivia returned from her shower, kissed me on the cheek like everything was normal, and sat across from me at the dinner table. I studied her face, her every move, searching for guilt, but she seemed utterly at ease. It was maddening. I knew I needed proof before confronting her. That's when I decided to dig deeper. The next morning, I woke before Olivia and sat in the dim light of our kitchen, staring into my coffee. I kept replaying the messages I'd read. My heart screamed to confront her immediately, but my mind urged caution. I needed to be sure, to have irrefutable proof. It was an unbearable contradiction. I loved her so much that the thought of her betrayal felt like a dagger to my chest, yet I couldn't shake the gnawing suspicion. I decided to take action. At lunch, I called a private investigator, James Reed, a quiet man who came highly recommended by a friend. When I explained the situation, he was sympathetic but professional. I'll need access to her schedule, any habits or routines you've noticed, and her vehicle information, he said. Give me a week, and I'll have answers for you. Handing over my suspicions to someone else felt strange, but it was also a relief. For once, I wasn't alone with my doubts. The week that followed was excruciating. Every day, I watched Olivia carefully, studying her smiles, her texts, her sudden urgency to leave the house. She started mentioning appointments with a gynecologist, a specialist she claimed was helping her with hormone issues since we'd been trying for a baby. It almost reassured me. Almost. But then I remembered that text from Dr. Parker, and my stomach churned. When the private investigator called a week later, his tone was grim. I think you should come in, he said. It's better if I explain this in person. My hands trembled as I drove to his office. The fluorescent lights and clinical setup made the place feel more like a hospital than a PI's workspace. James didn't waste time with pleasantries. He handed me a manila folder, his expression unreadable. Inside were photos. Olivia, in a coffee shop, sitting across from a man in his early 40s, handsome in a polished, smug way, dressed in a tailored suit. The timestamps showed several meetings over the last month. But the final set of pictures twisted the knife deeper. Olivia and the same man entering a hotel together. His arm was around her waist, and her head rested on his shoulder. It's not just the meetings, James said quietly. The man, Dr. Parker, is indeed her gynecologist. And based on my observations, I'm afraid their relationship isn't professional. I sat there in silence, my mind reeling. My wife wasn't just cheating. She was sleeping with a man who had been in a position of trust, someone who knew about our struggles, our plans to have a child. The betrayal was staggering. James continued, his voice hesitant. There's more. I looked into his background. He's married, with 2 kids. But it doesn't stop there. From what I've uncovered, this isn't the first time he's had an affair with a patient. Anger flared inside me like a wildfire. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. Does he even care that he's wrecking lives? I muttered through gritted teeth. James sighed. Men like him usually don't. I drove home that night feeling like a ghost. When I walked through the door, Olivia greeted me with her usual warmth. Hey, Han, she said, kissing my cheek. How was work? I looked at her, the woman I'd shared my life with for a decade, and felt a wave of disgust so strong it almost knocked me over. But I didn't let it show. Instead, I smiled faintly and said, busy. The hardest part was pretending everything was fine. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about confronting Olivia. It was about making her and Parker face the consequences of their actions. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Olivia slept soundly beside me. My mind churned with anger and questions. How long had she been seeing him? Was her love for me ever real, or had it faded while I wasn't looking? Every shared memory, every promise, now felt like a cruel joke. By morning, I had decided. I couldn't confront her yet, not until I knew everything. So I continued to play the part of the oblivious husband, all while digging deeper into her betrayal. James had given me a key piece of advice. Watch, but don't act rashly. People tend to slip when they think no one's paying attention. That week, Olivia's behavior grew more erratic. She was on her phone constantly, and I noticed she'd started leaving the room to take calls. One evening, I heard her laugh softly from the kitchen, her voice hushed. Don't worry, she said, her tone playful. It's all under control. He doesn't suspect a thing. My chest tightened, and I clenched the edge of the counter to steady myself. It took everything I had not to march into the kitchen and demand answers. Instead, I forced myself to sit on the couch, staring blankly at the TV while pretending not to hear. The next day, I installed a GPS tracker on her car. It was simple and discreet, something I never thought I'd do, but desperate times call for desperate measures. I told myself it wasn't paranoia. It was about protecting myself from her lies. By the end of the week, the tracker had confirmed what James's photos had hinted at. Frequent visits to Parker's office at odd hours and several trips to that same hotel. But what broke me wasn't the infidelity itself. It was what James uncovered next. On Friday afternoon, he called me, his voice laced with unease. Evan, I need to show you something. Can you meet me? When I arrived, he handed me another envelope. Inside were more photos and a medical document. My stomach dropped as I read it. It was an ultrasound report, dated 2 weeks ago. Olivia was pregnant. I stared at the document, my vision blurring with disbelief. She hadn't mentioned it, not a word. My heart screamed at me to believe the baby was mine, but the timing was suspicious. My head spun with questions. How long had she known? Had she planned to tell me? Or was she waiting to spring it on me after securing a future with Parker? James, ever cautious, cleared his throat. Evan, I don't know if this is your child, but given everything we've uncovered, it's worth preparing for the worst. I nodded numbly, unable to form words. The thought of Olivia carrying another man's child was a betrayal beyond what I could comprehend. That night, I returned home, determined to confront her. But when I opened the front door, the sight that greeted me stopped me in my tracks. Olivia was sitting at the dining table, a glass of wine in hand, and across from her sat Dr. Parker. They turned in unison, their faces frozen with shock at my sudden arrival. Well, I said, my voice cold, this should be interesting. The room went deathly quiet. Olivia's hand tightened around the stem of her wine glass as if it could ground her, while Parker shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his smugness noticeably absent. Evan, Olivia began, her voice calm but forced. You're home early. I let out a bitter laugh. Am I interrupting something? A private dinner? A strategy meeting? I stepped closer, my gaze burning into her. Or maybe you were just about to tell me the news? She blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right lie. Parker, however, was less composed. He cleared his throat and stood, his hands raised slightly in a placating gesture. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice rehearsed, "I think we should discuss this calmly." I pointed a finger at him, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Don't you dare try to play the voice of reason. You've been sleeping with my wife, and, if I'm not mistaken, she's pregnant. So tell me, doctor." I spat the word like venom. "Am I supposed to congratulate you, or throw you out of my house?" Olivia shot out of her chair, her voice rising. "Evan, stop. You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" I snapped, pulling out the manila folder James had given me. I slammed it onto the table, the papers spilling out, photos, texts, and the ultrasound report. "Care to explain this?" Her face went pale, and she glanced nervously at Parker. He avoided her gaze, suddenly looking far less confident. "Evan," she said, her voice trembling, "I didn't want you to find out like this." "Like this?" I echoed, my voice rising. "How exactly did you want me to find out, Olivia? Were you planning to wait until the baby was born to tell me it's not mine?" She recoiled as if I'd struck her. "It's not what you think." I slammed my hand on the table, making both of them jump. "Then explain it to me," I roared. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife is pregnant with another man's child after lying to me for months." Parker stepped forward, his hands still raised. "This isn't productive," he said. "We all need to." I cut him off with a glare. "If you say one more word, I swear I'll make you regret it." He backed down, raising his hands higher in surrender. Olivia's eyes filled with tears, but there was no sympathy left in me. "I never meant for this to happen," she whispered. "It was a mistake." "A mistake?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "Which part? Sleeping with him or getting caught?" Her silence spoke volumes. I ran a hand through my hair, pacing the room, my emotions oscillating between rage and heartbreak. "Do you even love me?" I finally asked, my voice quieter now, almost pleading. She hesitated, and that hesitation was answer enough. The final thread of hope I'd been clinging to snapped. I turned to Parker, my jaw clenched. "Get out," I said coldly. He hesitated, glancing at Olivia for guidance, but she looked away. I said, "Get out." My voice echoed through the house, leaving no room for argument. Parker grabbed his coat and made a hasty exit, mumbling something about leaving us to talk. As the door closed behind him, the silence in the house was deafening. I turned back to Olivia, who looked small and vulnerable for the first time in years. "I gave you everything," I said, my voice breaking. "And this is how you repay me?" She tried to speak, but no words came out. I shook my head, the weight of her betrayal suffocating me. "You need to pack your things," I said, my voice hollow. "I'll have the papers drawn up tomorrow." "Evan, please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We can fix this." I stared at her, my heart breaking all over again. "You already destroyed us, Olivia. There's nothing left to fix." And with that, I walked out the door, leaving her sobs echoing in the hollow shell of our home. I spent that night driving aimlessly, the city's bright lights blurring into a haze as I tried to make sense of everything. How had it come to this? The woman I thought I'd grow old with, the one I'd trusted with my heart, had thrown it all away. And for what? A cheap affair with her doctor? I eventually pulled into a quiet park, parking under a flickering streetlight. The stillness of the night was a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. My phone buzzed incessantly, texts and missed calls from Olivia, pleading for me to come home and talk. I turned it off, not ready to face her excuses. By morning, I'd made up my mind. This wasn't something I could forgive, nor was it something I wanted to fix. The betrayal was too deep, the lies too numerous. If Olivia and Parker thought they could dismantle my life and walk away unscathed, they were mistaken. I wasn't just going to leave her. I was going to make sure she felt the full weight of her choices. The next day, I met with a divorce lawyer, Sylvia Torres. Her reputation was ironclad, and within minutes of sitting down in her sleek office, I knew I'd made the right choice. "So, your wife cheated," Sylvia said bluntly, skimming through the file of evidence I'd brought. "And you're certain the child isn't yours?" "The timing doesn't line up," I replied. "And even if it did, I'm not staying with someone who's capable of this." She nodded, flipping through photos and the ultrasound report. "You have a solid case. We can push for a no-fault divorce, but given her actions, I recommend going after everything: house, assets, even spousal support if you're eligible." "I don't want her money," I said firmly, "but I want her to leave with nothing. She doesn't deserve to keep the life we built together." Sylvia's eyes gleamed with approval. "Good. Then let's make sure she doesn't." Over the next week, I worked with Sylvia to put everything into motion. I froze our joint accounts, changed the locks on the house, and made arrangements to have Olivia served with the divorce papers. Each step felt like regaining a piece of control, a way to fight back against the helplessness she'd made me feel. I also took the evidence James had gathered and sent it anonymously to the medical board overseeing Parker's practice. If he wanted to risk his career for an affair, then he'd pay the price for that too. When Olivia was finally served, the fallout was immediate. She showed up at my office, tears streaming down her face as she begged me to reconsider. "Evan, please," she sobbed. "We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes." I stared at her, unflinching. "You've already done enough." Her desperation turned to anger. "You think you're so perfect? Like you've never made mistakes?" she spat. "This isn't just my fault. You were never around. You were so focused on your work that I felt invisible." I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. "If you were unhappy, you could have talked to me. But instead, you chose to cheat. That's on you, Olivia." She opened her mouth to retort but faltered, unable to come up with a defense. Without another word, I turned and walked back into my office, leaving her standing there, defeated. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and the slow, painful process of dismantling our shared life. Friends and family reached out, offering their support, but I kept most of them at arm's length. I wasn't ready to share the full extent of what had happened, not yet. But even as I moved forward, the pain lingered. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the loss of the future I thought we'd have together. Every corner of the house reminded me of what I'd lost, from the photos on the walls to the faint scent of her perfume that still clung to the furniture. As much as I wanted to erase her from my life, I couldn't ignore the love I once felt. It was like mourning someone who was still alive, a strange, gut-wrenching limbo that left me questioning everything. But there was no turning back now. Olivia had made her choice, and I had made mine. This was just the beginning. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Sylvia moved swiftly, ensuring that every legal advantage was on my side. Olivia, meanwhile, oscillated between begging for forgiveness and raging against me. The contrast was almost laughable. One moment, she'd call, sobbing about how she missed me, and the next, she'd accuse me of overreacting. Each interaction reminded me why I was doing this. Meanwhile, James kept me updated on Parker. After receiving the report, the medical board launched an investigation. The man who had been so smug and untouchable now faced the possibility of losing his license. It was a small victory, but it was enough to keep me moving forward. Despite my anger, the reality of the situation was still overwhelming. Every time I passed a photo of Olivia or walked into the empty bedroom, the weight of her betrayal hit me all over again. I didn't just lose a wife. I lost the future I had planned, the kids we talked about, the trips we dreamed of taking, the quiet moments of growing old together. But I refused to let her destroy me completely. If she thought she could walk away unscathed, she was wrong. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some of Olivia's belongings to send to her temporary apartment, I stumbled across an old journal. It was tucked away in the back of our closet, forgotten amidst years of clutter. Part of me hesitated to open it, but curiosity got the better of me. The entry started innocently enough. Notes about our early days together, her excitement over our engagement, and her hopes for our future. But as I flipped further, the tone began to shift. There were mentions of feeling neglected, of longing for excitement and passion. And then, buried within the pages, was a name. Parker. The first mention was from nearly 2 years ago, a casual note about her new doctor being kind and attentive. But as the entries went on, her feelings became more explicit. She wrote about his compliments, the way he made her feel alive. One entry stopped me cold. I know it's wrong, but when I'm with him, I feel like the woman I used to be. Evan is wonderful, but he's so predictable. Parker makes me feel like I'm more than just a wife or a housekeeper. He sees me. What if this is what I've been missing all along? The words felt like a slap to the face. She didn't just cheat. She rationalized it, convincing herself that her feelings justified her actions. And all the while, I had been clueless, working tirelessly to provide for a life she had already decided wasn't enough. I closed the journal, my hands shaking. Any lingering doubts I had about my decision evaporated. Olivia didn't just betray me. She had been looking for an excuse to do so for years. The next time we met was at Sylvia's office to discuss the terms of the divorce. Olivia arrived first, looking exhausted and disheveled. The confident, composed woman I had once known was nowhere to be seen. When I entered, she looked up, her eyes pleading. "Evan, please, we don't have to do this. We can go to counseling, start over. I'll cut off all contact with Parker, I promise." I sat across from her, my expression calm but unyielding. "You made your choice, Olivia. Now you have to live with it." Sylvia laid out the terms. Olivia would get nothing but her car and the bare minimum she needed to move out. The house, the savings, and everything we built together would remain mine. "That's not fair," Olivia snapped, her composure cracking. "I gave 10 years to this marriage. I deserve something." I leaned forward, my voice low but firm. "What you deserve is a mirror. Maybe then you'll see what your selfishness has cost you." Her lawyer tried to argue, but Sylvia shut him down effortlessly. The evidence we had, the affair, the pregnancy, the financial records, left little room for negotiation. Olivia had no choice but to accept the terms or risk losing even more in court. By the time we left the office, she was a shell of the woman she had once been. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of satisfaction. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about reclaiming the power she had taken from me. That evening, I sat in the empty house, sipping whiskey and reflecting on everything that had happened. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. I was done being a victim. Olivia and Parker had underestimated me, but they wouldn't forget me. This was just the beginning of my new life, a life where I wouldn't let anyone take me for granted again. The house was eerily quiet that evening. Every creak of the floor and hum of the refrigerator seemed louder than usual. I poured myself another drink, the amber liquid swirling in my glass as I stared out the window into the darkness. The divorce papers were filed, Parker's career was under investigation, and Olivia was scrambling to figure out her next move. It should have felt like a victory, but it didn't, not entirely. I kept thinking about the journal, her words echoing in my mind. "Parker makes me feel alive." She'd chosen thrill over stability, lies over loyalty. As much as I wanted to move on, a part of me needed her to understand the devastation she'd caused. She couldn't just walk away thinking she had done nothing wrong. That's when the idea hit me. I called James the next morning and told him what I needed. "I want you to deliver something for me," I said. He chuckled. "You really like keeping me busy, huh? What's the plan?" Olivia doesn't just get to leave with a clean conscience. I want her to know exactly what her choices cost her, and me. 2 days later, James handed me a small box, neatly wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a collection of items that encapsulated our life together. Photos from our wedding, the positive pregnancy test she'd saved from when we thought we'd have kids, and even a trinket from our first anniversary, a glass figurine of a lighthouse. But there was one addition she wasn't expecting, a copy of her journal. I'd made photocopies of the most damning entries, highlighted passages where she rationalized her affair, and annotated them with my own thoughts. Beside one of her entries about feeling unseen, I wrote, "You were seen. You just weren't satisfied with what you had." On the back cover, I wrote one final note. "You chose Parker. Live with the consequences. Goodbye." The delivery was made while Olivia was at her temporary apartment. James reported back that she had answered the door looking exhausted, her face pale and gaunt. She took the package hesitantly, her brow furrowed as she thanked him and closed the door. I didn't hear from her for days after that. Part of me expected an angry call or a tearful message, but there was nothing. That silence spoke louder than any words she could have said. She'd read my words. She knew the depth of her betrayal, and, hopefully, she understood the pain she had inflicted on me. Meanwhile, Parker's world was crumbling. The medical board's investigation had intensified, and whispers about his inappropriate relationships with patients had begun to circulate. A colleague of his leaked a statement to the press, further tarnishing his reputation. He resigned from his practice to focus on personal matters, but the damage was done. One evening, I received an unexpected call from Parker's wife, Lisa. I debated whether to answer, but eventually picked up. Her voice was calm but cold. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "I just wanted to thank you." "For what?" I asked, caught off guard. "For sending me the evidence," she replied. "You didn't have to, but you did. And now I know the truth." "I thought you deserved to know," I said quietly. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "It's funny, isn't it? How people like Olivia and Parker think they can destroy lives without consequences." I didn't have an answer for that, so I stayed silent. "Well," she continued, her voice firm, "if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to call. People like them don't win in the end." By the time the divorce was finalized, Olivia had nothing left. She moved in with her sister, her pride battered and her reputation in tatters. Mutual friends drifted away from her, unable to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the choices she had made. As for me, I kept to myself, focusing on rebuilding my life. One evening, as I was packing up the last of her things to donate, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Olivia. "I know I have no right to ask this, but I need to know. Was I ever enough for you?" I stared at the message for a long time before typing my reply. "You were. You just didn't think I was enough for you." I hit send and blocked her number. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of peace. In the weeks following the divorce's finalization, I focused on reclaiming the life Olivia had shattered. I buried myself in work, taking on extra projects to keep my mind busy. My coworkers noticed the change. They stopped asking questions and just gave me space. But when I came home, the emptiness of the house hit me like a tidal wave. Every corner reminded me of her. The faint scent of her favorite perfume in the closet, the little notes she used to leave on the fridge, the photo albums tucked away in the living room. I spent one long, sleepless night packing those memories into boxes and moving them to the garage. I wasn't ready to throw them out, but I couldn't live with them staring me in the face every day. I started therapy on the advice of Sylvia, who told me it wasn't just about legal victories, it was about healing. At first, it felt strange to spill my thoughts to a stranger, but over time, I came to appreciate the space to vent. My therapist, Karen, was patient and understanding. "You can grieve, Evan," she said during one session. "You lost something important to you. But remember, grief doesn't mean weakness. It means you cared." Her words stuck with me. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to mourn. Not just the betrayal, but the love I had believed was real. One Saturday, I decided to get out of the house and visit a local park. The fresh air and sunlight were a welcome change from the suffocating walls of my home. As I walked along the trails, Max and Charlie trotted happily beside me, their tails wagging furiously. At one point, I stopped to tie my shoe when a woman jogged past, her own golden retriever bounding alongside her. She smiled at me, a brief but warm acknowledgement, before continuing on her way. I didn't think much of it until a few minutes later when her dog bolted back toward us, leash trailing behind him. Max and Charlie greeted him enthusiastically, and I bent down to grab the leash. "I'm so sorry," she called out, running up to us. Her face was flushed, but she was smiling. "Cooper gets a little too excited sometimes." "It's no problem," I said, handing her the leash. "Max and Charlie seem to like him." She laughed. "I think he likes them too." Her eyes flicked to mine. "I'm Lauren." "Evan," I replied, shaking her hand. We ended up talking for a while, sharing stories about our dogs and favorite spots in the city. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of genuine connection. When we parted ways, she waved and said, "Maybe I'll see you around." I couldn't stop smiling for the rest of the day. Over the next few weeks, Lauren and I crossed paths several more times at the park. Each meeting felt easier, more natural, until one day she suggested grabbing coffee. As we sat outside a cozy cafe, I told her a bit about my past, carefully omitting the details about Olivia. She shared her own story, including a divorce of her own. "Turns out my ex-husband had a thing for his secretary," she said with a wry smile. "Cliché, right?" I chuckled, the irony not lost on me. Clichés exist for a reason. Her laughter was warm, and for the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone in my pain. She understood in a way no one else could. Out of nowhere, I received another message from Olivia. She asked to meet for closure, claiming she needed to apologize face to face. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a small diner we used to frequent. She looked different. Her usual confidence was replaced with hesitation. "Evan," she began, her voice shaky, "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I need you to know I'm sorry." Her apology felt hollow, like she was saying it more for herself than for me. I nodded politely but didn't engage. "I hope someday you can forgive me," she added. I stood, placing some cash on the table for my coffee. "Forgiveness isn't about you, Olivia. It's about me. And I'll get there, just not today." I left without looking back. As things with Lauren progressed, I found myself grappling with fear. Trusting again felt like walking on thin ice. But Lauren was patient. She never pushed, letting me set the pace. One night, as we sat on my porch watching the sunset, I told her everything about Olivia, the betrayal, and the pain. She listened without judgment, her hand resting gently on mine. "You're stronger than you think, Evan," she said, "and you deserve happiness." Her words stayed with me, reminding me that the scars Olivia left didn't define me. Months later, I learned that Parker had lost his medical license. The board had found enough evidence of misconduct to strip him of his ability to practice. Olivia, meanwhile, was still working as a teacher but had moved to another district, likely trying to escape the fallout of her choices. It wasn't vindication that brought me peace, but knowing that their actions had consequences. They couldn't hurt anyone else the way they'd hurt me. Lauren and I continued to grow closer, our bond deepening with each passing day. She was everything Olivia wasn't: kind, supportive, and honest. One evening, as we sat under the stars, she turned to me and asked, "Do you think you'll ever love again?" I smiled, my heart lighter than it had been in years. "I think I already am." She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for the first time, I felt whole. On the anniversary of my divorce, I visited the park where I first met Lauren. Max, Charlie, and Cooper played together in the grass while we sat on a bench, watching the sunset. "I never thought I'd find happiness again," I admitted, "but you proved me wrong." She smiled, her eyes bright. Sometimes life gives us second chances when we least expect them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized I was finally free, not just from Olivia's betrayal, but from the weight of my own pain. I had survived, and I had found love again. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace whatever came next.